We're very pleased this afternoon to have with us Professor James Ketterer, who is the Director of International Economic Initiatives and Senior Fellow at the Institute of International Liberal Education at Bard College in New York. The title today of this Noisy Reality presentation is U.S. Policy in the Middle East, From the Frying Pan into the Fire. Now, James Ketterer is a Senior Fellow at the Bard College Center for Civic Engagement, where he is teaching in the Master of Arts in Global Studies program. Until recently, he was the Dean of the School of Continuing Education at the American University in Cairo. He previously served as Dean of International Studies at Bard College and Academic Director of the Bard Globalization and International Affairs program. Jim Ketterer previously served in Egypt as Director for AMIDEAST, a U.S. educational and cultural affairs NGO. Prior to that, he was Vice Chancellor for Policy and Planning and Deputy Provost at the SUNY State University of New York. At SUNY, he was also the Director of the Center for International Development. In government, he has served on the New York Commission on Higher Education, the NSC, the National Security Council staff at the White House, and as a policy analyst at the New York Senate. He's worked on elections for the United Nations, the African American Institute, and the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, OECD, and also has carried out consultancies for U.S. aid in Middle East, Africa, and Asia. He was a Boren Fellow in Morocco, a Rotary Ambassador Scholar in Tunisia, and a visiting lecturer at the National University in Lviv, Ukraine. He serves on the boards of the Swedish program at the Stockholm School of Economics, WASLA Connect, and the Middle East Research Information Project, MERIP. So, I want to first of all thank Jim for spending time with us today and start talking about what is going on here. Jim, thank you for joining us.
And Jim, thanks for having me.
First, let's talk about what's going on at the university level in this country. Let's start with Columbia, which a number of us know pretty well. And here we're in a situation at Columbia where the university has basically been hit with a $400 million federal diminution of its money. They could even go after even higher amounts. Some have estimates that they could, in extreme cases, go after $1.3 billion of federal aid. You've had, in the situation in New York, most prominently has been the arrest of 𝐊𝐚𝐽𝐿 Khalil, who was a student at the School of International Affairs. He was arrested and sent down to Louisiana. You had the New York Times report a self-deportation of a doctoral candidate, Ranjani Srinivasaran, who left and went to Canada. And then there was an arrest in Newark of a student named 𝐊𝐞𝐭𝐭𝐞𝐫, who was arrested and sent to Texas. Now, during this period of time, you've had expulsions of students. You've had Columbia now is being investigated today. It's announced for harboring illegal aliens. And I should note that the university has fired, before negotiations, they fired a student union president. But behind this backdrop, of course, is a wider attack on higher education that cannot be underestimated. There was an article, an op-ed piece by Max Eden in the Washington Examiner in December of last year, where he basically made a whole series of recommendations to Linda McMahon to come in. And one of them was basically the objective should be to destroy Columbia University. He explicitly stated that. And we saw the letter that was sent by the federal government, including reorganizing and supervising one of the departments in the university. So I'm just wondering, Jim, what's your reaction to all this going on? What's your opinion?
Well, Jim, I'm glad that you started with that because I think it's a very, very serious situation. And I've taken note of the fact that in the past few weeks and as the tempo of all these things have picked up, even in the past few days, the extent to which I've had difficulty in getting people to see the urgency and the seriousness of all this in the broader context. And the way that you set the scene for this, I think, is exactly right. Specifically to Colombia and the specific cases that you mentioned, but then the
Right.
broader strategy that appears to be underway here. And I just want to mention that I saw just before we got on today, I saw this very brief quote from Lee Bollinger, the former Columbia president, also the president of Michigan, the dean of Michigan law, and a First Amendment scholar. And not somebody who's a wild-eyed radical, but he says this. He says we're in the midst of an authoritarian takeover of the U.S. government. It's been coming and coming, and not everybody's prepared to read it that way. The characters regarded as people to emulate, like Orban and Putin and so on, all indicate that the strategy is to create an illiberal democracy, or an authoritarian democracy, or a strongman democracy. That's what we're experiencing. Our problem, in part, is a failure of imagination. We cannot get ourselves to see how this is going to unfold in its most frightening versions. You neutralize the branches of government, you neutralize the media, you neutralize the university, and you're on your way. We're beginning to see the effects on universities. It's very, very frightening. And I think that sentence in there, our problem in part, is a failure of imagination. And that failure of imagination leads to a lack of urgency, leads to lack of an understanding of the overall seriousness of the situation and what is really underway. I mean, the details of these cases of the students, I think two students who have been arrested and one who fled and went to Canada, those are certainly chilling and noteworthy, and also are being paid close attention to across the Middle East and North Africa. But beyond those cases and beyond the specifics of Colombia and the money taken away from Colombia, the overall plan that appears to be taking shape, and the administration itself, releasing a broader list of universities that will be and already are under scrutiny. I think this is deeply, deeply, deeply disturbing. Now, in terms of the way that it resonates in the Middle East, this is also happening at the same time where we see our institutions, our American institutions in the Middle East, also, suffering loss of funding. My former institution, the American University in Cairo, lost a tremendous amount of money and scholarships and projects and programs that were funded by the U.S. government in the abrupt closure of USAID. And in addition, programs like the State Department's program Education USA, which represents higher education broadly around the world, and certainly in the Middle East and North Africa. And I used to oversee that program in Egypt when I was with AMIDEAST. That has also been shuttered. So when you put all of these things together, I think one has to say, well, is this just kind of, intuitive and random and as disturbing as it is this just kind of a moment to get through? Or as Lee Bollinger was saying, do we see something much, much, much deeper and more concerning underway? And I think it's the latter, unfortunately.
Yeah, there was an op-ed piece in the Times yesterday with Masha Geeson and others that sort of went into this. And you have you have Johns Hopkins had 800 million taken from it. I
Yeah.
mean, and part of this is that you have this idea that let's go after what, and I'm just talking about and I say this word with the French spirit of that, the mentalité, if you will, of those who think that, well, let's go after the institutions that breed this globalist liberal cadre and destroy them and gut them. And in this article by Max Eden, he talks about the need to create alternative institutions along the lines of probably what we see DeSantis doing in Florida after gutting the different university and free university initiatives down there. And that's their plan, to basically create a questioning of what is fact, what is truth, what object who defines what is truth. Now, let me just shift a little bit into a related issue, and that is the decision by the administration to uh, resuscitate the Alien and Enemies Act of 1798, which they've just done in deporting a whole bunch of members of a Venezuelan gang. But that in particular can be used, since the historical context of it was to be directed against representatives of the French revolutionary government in the United States at the time. So ideas can be the subject of targets, and that raises a whole other series of questions about, we might have someone like 𝐉𝐚𝐬𝐞𝐬 as a target, but when will this shift, and then American citizens will be attacked exercising their constitutional rights or their First Amendment rights? That to me is another troubling aspect of this.
Yeah, it's it's deeply troubling. What is also, I think, a real moment to take stock of is the initial court ruling that is suspending the Trump actions under that Alien Seditions Act. And then the question is, as it is with many of these court rulings, will the administration heed the ruling? Will they just blatantly ignore it and press on? And or will they try to find ways that are maybe less blatant, but still undermining not only that particular decision, but the legitimacy of the courts in general? And by calling out, specific judges and saying that they are, working against the will of the people, etc., this is really deeply disturbing. And I want to, on the question of ideas and being subject of criminal prosecution or deportation because of ideas, I also want to say that to circle back just for a second too to our previous conversation about universities. So our universities, American universities, despite all the other ups and downs of the United States and ups and downs of U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East and North Africa, our universities have continued to be really having this magnetizing effect on people, and a draw to people from around the world, and certainly from the Middle East and North Africa, people wanting to come here to study and being drawn to the openness of our universities, their creativity, the fact that they really are these generators of great research and are on the cutting edge. So if we are to undermine that, those institutions that John Waterbury's article said, the headline was "Hate Your Policies, Love Your Institutions." The kind of the number one thing that draws such an amazing array of talent to our country. This I wonder how. I mean, this is obviously bad on the face of it, but I also wonder about how it plays out politically, because we have 4,000 and something universities and colleges across the country, and as they all start to get hit in this way, some of them are in red states, some of them are in red congressional districts. These are major employers in many districts. You mentioned Johns Hopkins. Hopkins, I think, is, if not the biggest employer in the state of Maryland. It's close to it, and others across the country. At what point will all of these hits on drawing international students, on the loss of jobs, on the loss of research money, at what point will there start to be some blowback to members of Congress and senators who will say, listen, this is just simply unsustainable for my state or my district?
Yeah, well, of course, they talk about the University of Alabama as being a particular aspect of that. And then when you see these studies about the tariff policies, that red states are going to get hit the worst. I watched in its entirety the town hall that Representative Chuck Edwards did in North Carolina. And it was quite lively, and you could see that, yeah, sure, there are probably a lot of Democrats who came in there, but you're going to have people who voted for Trump. I've had people come up and apologize to me for voting for Trump. So, but let's get into the soft power issue that you want to talk about, and that is the USAID policy. I also was watching a teach-in that was held in South Africa, which was the excuse by Secretary of State Rubio to throw the South African ambassador out of the United States. And in that, they had a woman who was talking about the necessity and practical benefits of the USAID support for dealing with HIV/AIDS in South Africa, and basically how the pulling out of the United States has essentially, hurt this very practical public health policy. And I'm wondering how you see these soft power issues resonating in the Middle East with issues that you're very familiar with.
Yeah, well, the public health aspect of the closure of USAID is the one that I think, and rightly so, gets a lot of people's attention. It has the kind of the most immediate and most tangible negative effects. I mean, it's affecting people's healths and people's health and people's lives. And that particular program that you were referring to was started by George W. Bush, has had great bipartisan support for a very long time, the President's Emergency Program for AIDS Relief, PEPFAR, and might well be the most successful, most important international development public health program in history. And so to undo that is going to generate these kinds of stories that you just mentioned, and rightly so. And there are people out who are trying to give the details on these results. I think in addition to that, what is also lost are the many other programs that not just implemented by USAID and USAID contractors, but also other public diplomacy programs. So if we look just at the Middle East and North Africa, we look across the region, you have the embassies, you have public affairs sections in each of those embassies that are running public diplomacy programs. You also have had USAID missions that have been very important, let's say just in Egypt, where I was between both times for almost 7 years. Those programs we're funding students, funding scholarships, funding infrastructure, funding water research, funding public health issues, all sorts of things, and employing many Egyptians, in the case of Egypt, as well as bringing in people from the outside as experts to work on these programs, and creating real, tangible, positive results. And so the amount of money that is spent on these programs is really negligible when compared to the entirety of the U.S. federal budget, but even when compared to the Pentagon's budget or many other things. And so it says to me, this really isn't about saving money. This is about dismantling these parts of the U.S. government that somehow or another are aggravating the kinds of authoritarian regimes that the United States seems to be aligning itself with. And, in addition to USAID, you have the many other less known programs, but still vitally important. I mean, just this weekend, I think, Voice of America was ended. You have the Wilson Center in Washington that apparently is going to be put to bed. You have a wide variety of these things, and you have program by program. For instance, you mentioned in my too long bio, Jim, that I've done work with the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. The U.S. is a member state. We have signed a treaty to be a member of that organization and to participate in things that organization does, including its Office of Democracy and Human Rights. And we have, in the last 2 months, taken ourselves out of that. We're still technically in the OSCE, but we are not sending anybody as long-term or short-term observers for elections. We're not involved in many of the other things the OSCE does. And so that's not the Middle East and North Africa, but it is 57 countries from I think Vancouver to Vladivostok, as they say, and it's one of the few organizations where we could work in some level of cooperation with the Russians. And that's all on hold. And why? It's not about money. It's a negligible amount of money. And I think people should be asking really serious questions about the deeper why questions underpinning all of this. I saw Senator Chris Murphy talking about the fallout of the vote on the federal budget and some Democrats deciding to support that as it went forward, to support the Republican initiatives. And Murphy was basically saying, we need to have people take this seriously. This isn't just normal politics. That's not is what is happening here. This is something much more serious, much more dangerous, and much more immediate than just kind of waiting for the next midterm elections and seeing if that could kind of right the ship. I think that is completely misguided at this point, and certainly misguided as we look about the U.S. Relations in the Middle East. So I just want to say one other thing about the soft power, and it's easy to, I think, just focus on these internecine struggles within Washington and policy at the highest of levels, but where it really matters is on the ground in each of the countries in the region, and the way that that U.S. presence, when it is pulled back, that vacuum that's created, who's going to fill it? And for sure, our adversaries will fill it in one way or another.
All right, let's turn to a broader question, and that is we have this litany of opinion about Trump 2.0, how better prepared he is, Project 2025. He's learned lessons from 4 years of being president and also 4 years of being out of power, if you will. Uh, and you have all these different initiatives that some take great umbrage with. For example, his reference to President McKinley in talking about how Greenland should be taken into the United States. We should reconquer the Panama Canal. We should turn Canada into the 51st state, etc. You have these tariff uh, initiatives raised by Trump that essentially, as I mentioned earlier, when you do studies about how they affect people at the grassroots level, they're going to hurt red voters as well as purple and blue voters. And you have people resuscitating the famous comment that was made by Richard Nixon, H.R. Haldeman, of the madman theory. I mean, Trump, the madman theory being used on steroids. And I'm just curious about your take on this shift in American foreign policy that we see going on right now. One that was a retreat from Atlanticism into essentially American first isolationism a la 1940.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure 1940 is far enough to go back to this, because I think, as you mentioned, the tariffs, you mentioned Canada and the other countries that are involved in this new trade war. I do think you have to go back to McKinley and the use of tariffs and this kind of mercantilist approach to international economics. And, I think one has to be careful as to whether or not, by even giving it some theory, are we giving these actions a sane washing? Are we giving them a theory that we can use to try to understand what's happening, but is not really driving this? Is this really about retribution? Is this about kind of marrying up economics with geostrategic expansion? And why Canada, why Greenland in particular in those? I mean, I think that it sounds kind of almost ridiculous and brings to mind, the Michael Moore movie Canadian Bacon. But at the same time, these are serious threats to the sovereignty of Canada, as an example, and those threats also are taking place. If you look at the map, if you look at the globe from the very top, and you see Greenland and you see Canada, and who do you see right next door but Russia? So this kind of pincer maneuver on Canada's sovereignty, with the Russians from the north and the Americans from the south, I can tell you that Canadians are taking this really very, very seriously, and not as a joke, and not as just kind of a throwaway comments. And so the tariffs are, I think, one part of something much broader. We know from former Prime Minister Trudeau that in his conversations with Donald Trump, the questions of the treaty that demarcates the borders between the United States and Canada was brought up. The agreement on the demarcation of the Great Lakes between the two countries was brought up. Um, these are more than just idle comments and one-off laugh lines. These are serious threats, and I think it bears us wondering where this is all going. How does it affect then the broader, relationship with NATO? And at the same time, we're having to see a huge change in U.S. policy on Ukraine. It's head spinning to try to keep track of all that's happening at the same time. And, Jim, you talked about Trump 2.0, and certainly one thing that's different is just the tempo of all of these things. 4 years of planning, a specific playbook, Project 2025, and hitting the ground, moving at very, very quick speeds.
Yeah, of course. And Steve Bannon has that famous comment about basically overload the media. Make sure that there's a whole bunch of things each day that overwhelms them and they can only focus on one, but we just keep on moving and doing it every day. Uh, Now, you have, of course, the frankly, to me, absurd mention by Trump of turning Gaza into the Riviera that occurred just weeks ago. And I just wanted you to share your opinion on how this would affect the Middle East, in particular Egypt and Jordan.
Yeah. Um, Again, when you see the AI generated video that was released about Gaza, and you hear Donald Trump talk about a new I think he called it a potentially a new Riviera. Um, it has the potential for people to just say like, well, that's just he's just talking off the cuff, and we have to kind of not take him so seriously, and it's almost laughable. People aren't laughing in many corners. And this has clearly been something on the minds of many for quite some time. Jared Kushner was interviewed in a sit down at the Harvard Kennedy School, I think it was a year ago, and he talked about how this is really great. This is a great real estate deal, that this Gaza, with its coastal properties, and if you could just kind of, clean it out and start again, we could really make it something. And Trump was not in power at the time, and this was just his son-in-law. But we've seen this idea circulate back. I have to say, not too long after October 7th, I started to hear through other sources that there were some elements of the Israeli cabinet that were working in close communication with some elements of the Egyptian regime to try to engineer the displacement of, if not all, many of those in Gaza into Sinai. And that this was part of the conversation that was happening back channel between the Egyptians and the Israelis. And people often forget that the current Egyptian government is no fan of Hamas. They are an outgrowth of the Muslim Brotherhood, and the Muslim Brotherhood has been declared illegal and a terrorist organization in Egypt. So there is that element of this story, and then the willingness of some, who knows how far to the top this might go in Egypt or how accurate all the information is, but these are rumblings I heard for a long time before Trump was elected and before he was saying these things in the way that he's saying now. So this is something that I think obviously it doesn't take me to say it, but this constitutes ethnic cleansing. And if this were to happen in a way that were just blatantly facilitating it from the Egyptian side, obviously there would be tremendous blowback from the Egyptian people. However, it appears that the Trump administration and others would like to wrap a bow around this and call this all a great humanitarian gesture, and that this would be to the great benefit of Palestinians in general. I think more recently I've seen that they've they've talked about maybe relocating some, if not larger numbers, to Sudan and Somalia. And it's, you know, any talk that this might be temporary is seen as absolutely no-go talk by Palestinians, because you just have to look at others who were moved out in a so-called temporary basis, and that they're still in camps in Lebanon and Jordan. So, I think this gap between the way that in the people in general, let's say in Egypt, where I've been most recently for some length of time, and then those in government slash military in Egypt, it's an enormous gap, and how the Egyptian government would address that, even though it's largely an authoritarian regime, that's a whole lot of Egyptians who would be profoundly not just upset, but deeply angry if this were facilitated.
Well, they've actually, some people have said in Egypt that this is a casus belli, if in fact this is actually considered as a policy option. And then, of course, you have the question of totally destabilizing an ally of the United States, the Hashemite monarchy, by
Right.
simply not only, hundreds of thousands from Gaza, but probably hundreds of thousands from the West Bank. And Sudan has rejected this. Somalia and Somaliland, they haven't even responded. They've said, well, we're not really been contacted by the White House. So it leads me to another question before we bring people on with comments, and that is the counter to this, which was organized by Egypt. It was passed by the Arab League, a $53 billion reconstruction project. And one of the things I did before we did this to sort of calculate the enormity of the destruction in Gaza is do a quick tabulation. And we're talking about how do you remove, in New York City, almost 2,000 blocks, destroyed blocks of rubble. That's what we're talking about. 2,000 blocks of destroyed rubble. So, what is your assessment of the Arab League and all the probabilities and problems with this reconstruction plan that Sisi has argued for?
You know, a reconstruction plan without it being tied to some sort of political horizon that would address governance in Gaza, governance without displacement of Gazans, more displacement than's already happened, and would also address the West Bank, which I think, unless you're really going out of your way as an American reader of the news, you're not seeing much on the West Bank. But the West Bank, even before October 7th, was on the boil, and it has just increased in temperature. And so what's going on there, I think, is dire and is immediate. So without really addressing that, to just say, well, there's going to be this reconstruction, and but we're not going to say who is really going to be in charge of the place, how it's going to operate, what is going to be the next steps toward negotiations between the Israelis and the Palestinians. That just seems like at best, it's a fool's errand. I think you have to just take it as almost kind of performative from the Arab League.
Now, of course, before we bring on comments, we have the situation in Syria. We just had, in the past week and a half, renewed fighting, essentially a ethnic cleansing operation through the Alawite areas of Syria in Tartus and Latakia. Supposedly about 1,000 people, mainly civilians, killed by the new regime, and the issue of that situation resolving itself. But then, of course, we just also had yesterday the beginning of an air bombardment, an air campaign against Yemen, against the Houthis. with a task force off, probably operating the Red Sea, an aircraft carrier with a submarine, a Tomahawk equipped submarine, engaging in this air bombardment and specifically targeted against Iran. I know we have Gary on the phone, so we can get his opinion in a few minutes. But, how do you see all that interrelating to what Trump's policy is? Is it just simply imperial impulses, which some argue vestigially asserting themselves? What are we seeing here?
Well, on Yemen and the Houthis, I think we also need to keep in mind that the U.S. was engaged in actual shooting with under the Biden administration. So, what this appears to be, upping the tempo, and but I haven't seen, and I've been trying to find, what the specific plan might be. What is the strategy going forward with this new initiative from the Trump administration? Is there something new that's being done? Is it just more of what was being done before, but now it's going to be more and it's going to be announced and packaged in a different way? It's entirely unclear to me. And even if there is a specific plan and it's a new plan, I would like to see some specifics on how it might, in fact, be successful. Successful both militarily, but also successful politically. In terms of Syria, we have so many cooks in that oven, not just of the various Syrian political forces and military forces, but we have so many outside forces, including the United States and the Russians and others. And so, is there, now that the Trump administration is back in office, do they have a specific plan? Do they have a desire to see certain outcomes, one or another? I mean, I think most of the comments that I've heard from Trump on Syria are very dismissive of it as being centrally important to U.S. foreign policy. I would argue that it is quite important, and because not just of where it's located, so it's geostrategically important, but because that it has drawn in so many of the other actors in the region and from outside the region into the region. And so to not have a plan, not have something substantive to say about it, I think is really just kind of a dereliction of diplomatic duty.
So do you
Of
see
course, I'm interested to hear what Gary has to say, particularly about the Iranian component of all this, because Trump has talked about his desire to circle back and negotiate with the Iranians, but at the same time talking tough and and issuing some threats to the Iranians as well.
we'll circle back to Gary in a moment. Finally, the issue of the status right now in the peace talks between Hamas and Israel. Some are arguing that the United States, with this initiative to basically get Eden Alexander out and some other bodies that were part of a deal they were negotiating separately with Hamas, and that, of course, annoyed Israel. But then people are arguing that, well, Israel has no intention to move to phase two because then they have to withdraw from Gaza completely. And how are you understanding where we're at with all this right now?
As the Trump administration was coming into office and phase one of this ceasefire deal was being put in place, I was really stunned to see how many, I think, otherwise well-intentioned and smart people were applauding the Trump administration and saying, wow, they really pulled off something great here. And my understanding from talking to lots of people and getting a sense of the conversations that were happening behind the scenes is that essentially that as the Biden people were handing it off to the Trump people and this was all ongoing, that the message was being sent very clearly to Netanyahu and particularly to some of the most right-wing people on his cabinet that basically accept phase one, we'll do this, and we don't have to worry about the other phases. In fact, we're going to give you a green light to do all kinds of other things going forward. Just let us get in and get in office and take control of things. So whether or not that's all true, I don't know specifically, but if we look at the evidence now, it certainly seems to be following that trajectory. If you look back to just in general of what might happen in Gaza, if in fact Israel were to pull out, let's say there's going to be a phase two. Before October 7th, just the day before, there was a release of the survey, the Arab Barometer, and it indicated very clearly and not surprisingly that Hamas was enormously unpopular with its own people, and that what has transpired since has, I think, unfortunately, because Hamas, I think, is not a helpful actor to this situation. I think it has increased their popularity, and if not increased the popularity of the specific people who are running the organization, has increased support for the idea that armed revolt is the only option available to Palestinians, that without the political horizon that I was discussing before, without the option of any kind of hope of in any way of any sort of settlement that would be sustainable and just, that's all that's left. And that on one side is seen now as a major block to moving forward, and on the other side, that the Israeli cabinet is seen that they're getting a green light from Washington to consider all kinds of options in Gaza that have to do with actually just removing people, and all kinds of options in the West Bank that have to do with annexation. And I think this is not just bad in terms of the conduct of international law, bad for Palestinians. I think it's also bad for Israeli security going forward.
Thank you. Now, Gary, Gary wanted to add comments. I see your hand earlier, Dimitri. I'll get to you in a moment. Gary, do you want to unmute for a second? You got some comments about Iran?
Sorry about that. Can't keep my point straight. Anyway, with regard to Iran, they've taken a real beating over what's happened to Hezbollah in Lebanon, that they've been decapitated, and certainly the loss of Assad, which they had sponsored for some time, was a big deal. And then, I mean, the Houthis, I feel very much that what the Houthis are doing has only a very little to do with Iran itself. Iran is being very generous in providing weaponry and support when necessary, but they are not telling the Houthis how to conduct their activities in the region. I'm much more concerned here in the sense Iran, having taken a beating, is not going to go away, and it actually has strengthened its position as it was beaten up elsewhere. It has strengthened its position with Saudi Arabia and UAE and other countries in the region that are our allies, and we're going to have to deal with Iran in a very different way. And I think President Trump has actually come to the realization that his initial policy in Iran, let's due to extreme extreme actions, this extreme policy, extreme actions to try to stop Iran, didn't work at all by taking us out of the JCPOA, and basically Iran then was turned loose to go ahead and explore the idea of bomb, and they had actually done away with most of their actual product of in the Iran in the nuclear area when Trump took them out of the equation. And from that point on, Iran's only lever, other than its ability to use these Hezbollah and the others, their one lever has been the threat of going nuclear. That Iran has simply come to rely on that as its one strong suit that it can use to move the United States and to open up a different way of thinking. Well, Trump, by taking us out of the 𝐊𝐶POA, in effect, pushed Iran back to using the nuclear threat again. And now Iran is, as we all know, right on the verge of being able to actually create a nuclear weapon in a very short period of time, whereas it was a year away at a minimum after the 𝐊𝐶POA. And that is you asked Jim in the earlier stages of the discussion what Jim Ketterer, you had mentioned the plan. Was there a plan behind all of this? And that is my big concern. I mean, what are we aiming at as a country in the Middle East, our position? And I see, although it's easy to say that it's simply chaotic right now, which it is, but that do we have something at the end of the line? Do we have something where if, in fact, things go our way or our policies begin to take effect, that in fact it's going to result in an outcome that is understandable, or at least is something desirable for us. And I simply don't see it. I mean, this administration, for all of its ability to move fast and break things, has not, in effect, been creating any kind of a coherent plan that would, at the end of the day, actually improve American security, its financial situation, whatever. And there is a question on the domestic side about how long does it take for, or does the Trump supporter group even come to that conclusion, because they've indicated that they don't change their opinion regardless of what happens. But putting that aside, that's probably wrong. And how long does it take? And how many people have to join in to actually have an impact on this? And is there a plan at the end of the day? And I simply don't see the plan emerging. It's like a scattershot attempt to deal with one problem here, one problem there. And basically the idea of destruction, shock, and awe are supposed to be enough to take care of the game without actually producing something on the other end and standing up and saying, okay, here's where we were to begin with, here's where we are now, and this is where we're going. And that is completely missing from this administration. But yeah, with regard to the Middle East, I think the Biden administration made a lot of mistakes. I really disagreed with their policy almost entirely in terms of actually coming up with anything that was going to do us any good. And I certainly disagree with the Trump administration, which I see as different, but certainly in terms of noise. I must say that at least in the first term of Trump, I thought the Middle East countries felt rather comfortable with Trump, that they felt that this is the kind of guy we've been dealing with for years. We know what autocratic leaders are. We know how to, and we know how to please them. We know how to flatter their egos so that they, in fact, respond positively to us. And we know how to deal with people who are transactional. We're used to being paid for what we do or paying for what somebody else does, and that's a normal state of events as far as the Middle East is concerned. But the second time around, I think they went in with that, but Trump is unleashed in a way that he wasn't in the first term, that he had some restrictions on him, and he kept trying to find ways around them, but by staying pretty much close to the center of all of the people all the professionals who were around him. That has gone, and he is now at large. And I think the Middle East countries And I think Gaza was the breaking point. I mean, where the whole idea of the Riviera and so forth, they looked at that and said, yeah, this can't be serious. And it wasn't something that was transactional. It was just pie in the sky. In any case, I've talked too much, but I do think that the absence of any concept of a strategy is what is missing in the situation. And I don't see us getting any closer to that day by day. I'm sorry.
Yeah, go on, Jim.
Jim, could I just follow up on a couple of things that Gary said?
Of course.
Yeah, I mean, number one, I just applaud Gary for pointing out that the Houthis have their own agency. They have their own things that they're concerned about, their own things that they're fighting for. So to purely position the Houthis as a proxy of the Iranians, and that attacking them is a way to attack their proxy and therefore to attack Iranian interests, that misses a lot of the details and nuance, and misses it is kind of a replay of a lot of kind of the worst of Washington tendencies to see everything through the lens of one or two variables and miss all the details. Then the devil is in the details, and so I think that's a very important clarification that Gary made, and it's also important because it has to do with what would actually constitute prevailing in whatever fight we're in now against the Houthis. How is it defined? What are the objectives? To do what, against who, when, how, where? So that's one thing. The second thing is on the interconnectedness of the nuclear issue. And so the idea that the Iranians are kind of taking stock of what's going on in the region and their losses around the region, but also looking beyond the region and looking at, I think, nuclear case in point of our moment, which is Ukraine. And people may have forgotten that at the end of the Cold War, Ukraine inherited nuclear weapons from the Soviet Union. And there was great concern about the security of those weapons. There was concern in Ukraine, and there was concern globally about the security of those nukes. And so negotiations were undertaken, and an agreement was come to called the Budapest Memorandum that was signed by the US, the UK, the Russians, the Ukrainians, and maybe the Chinese too. And it basically said that those weapons would be removed from Ukraine, and that in return, that the territorial integrity of Ukraine would be protected. And so in 2014, when the Russians came back into, depending on your perspective, Crimea, and when fighting started happening in the Donbass, and the territorial integrity was not protected, the Obama administration did nothing about it. That sent a very clear message to our NATO partners, number one, that the United States really might not be taking things like Article 5 as seriously as we had hoped they would. I mean, Ukraine is not and was not a NATO country, but still, we had a signed agreement and we didn't follow up on it. And secondly, just the broader case that, people wonder, it's an interesting thought experiment to wonder if Ukraine had retained those nuclear weapons, would the Russians have invaded more recently? And the third thing I want to follow up on that Gary said was about the plan. And so Gary and I both at different times worked in the National Security Council, which is an institution that is designed to manage an interagency process in the United States government on national security issues, where plans and strategies and the specifics of moving the great ship of state around toward new policies happens. And it's a slow, sometimes really maddening process, but it is slow and maddening and sometimes adversarial for a very good reason, because then you can come up with a plan that is well articulated, well understood across the government, hopefully articulated to the American people, and there is in fact a plan, and there's something that can be made sense of. You can like it or not like it, you can change it if needed to be changed, but that process was painstakingly put in process and used for decades following 1947 for very good reason, because as maddening as it could be, it essentially worked. So it seems to me that is being completely circumvented and not involved at all in what is going on in U.S. policy in the Middle East now. And if there is a plan, we don't know about it. If there isn't a plan, it's because this process has been circumvented.
Well, one point I want to make, I've been preparing to interview Michael Wolff, who did several books on Trump. His latest book, All or Nothing, How Trump Recaptured America. Essentially, the point there he makes is that Trump would insist during his travails with all the lawsuits he was facing, the media is the strategy, is the legal strategy, the legal strategy is the media. And then you go back to Bannon's famous comment to Michael Lewis in 2018, the Democrats don't matter. The real opposition is the media. And the way to deal with them is to flood the zone with shit. And, so part of what I see here, what is strategy? Well, again, a media opportunity is how Trump views it. Remember at the end of the Zelensky travesty, he goes, oh, this is great television. And so that is a factor, I think, that has to be put into the mix here. Now, Dimitri, you had your hand up way before anybody else. So please, unmute and ask your comment or question. Go on, Dimitri.
I have some comments about starting from the conversation about universities and events of deporting some people. The presentation was unbelievably one-sided because nobody mentioned the cause of these actions. It's anti-Semitic riots and harassing Jewish students at this university. The cause why Columbia lost so much money was these events which we have seen last year as pro-Hamas demonstrations and clearly ignoring everything what supposed to be rules of behavior of the students on campus. And the leadership of Columbia ignored or the actions were so weak that nothing happened. This was also happened in these universities which are addressed right now by the commission. So it's not random universities. You do not to generalize it to 400 universities. It is the cause. And these foreign agents who come to United States and their desire to create this atmosphere and lead these disturbances should be stopped. You can argue about how far it will go. This up to courts to decide. The second thing about Iran. Nobody ever thought about invading Iran. So analogy with the Ukraine is not a good one. So Iran is more interested in not global, but regional domination. And that's Houthis are, Hezbollah was, and Hamas was the kind of offshoots of Iranian influence. Maybe Houthis, of course, have their regional issues like Hezbollah had, but they were shooting the ships in the Red Sea by Iranian missiles, not somebody else. Without Iranian weapons, they will never shoot a single boat. So that's the cause of this thing. And that's what I want to comment.
All right. Well, thank you, Dimitri. And, I disagree respectfully on the issue of Colombia. I'm stating that as someone who's been involved and watched this issue evolve at the university for 50 years. And I personally do not, I've heard people come out with all sorts of ridiculous comments about this issue going back to 1971, 72, 73, at that period of time. And comments which are anti Semitic, absolutely. No ambiguity about that. However, to characterize, I just don't, the university as a whole is not, some seed bed for anti-Semitism. They've been taking very strong initiatives to deal with this issue for the past 2 years. I myself have been participating in some of these. And, I think that the target, I mean, we can disagree about this, but I think the target really is one of a more wider sweep about the interpretation and the role and function of a university in our society. I think that's the more strategic goal that we see manifested here. Some of the comments made, I'm not a defender of Hamas, I never will be. I certainly condemn what happened on October 7th unequivocally, and but I also know people who, on both sides of the fence, lost relatives. I know people who lost loved ones who were killed at the rave on October 7th, and I know people who lost relatives in the bombing of Gaza. So, I sort of have to view it from that point of view. But I'll let others talk about Iran. Jim?
Yeah, well, one thing I want to say about universities too is that so Johns Hopkins had $800 million pulled back, and this had nothing to do with protests or Palestinian. This had all to do really with public health issues. The 2,000 people in the first wave of people that were fired from Johns Hopkins were largely people who worked for JPIGO and other public health institutions, the Bloomberg School of Public Health. So I do see the real, not just danger, but the tangible steps toward moving on universities that are beyond this specific issue of protests, the kind of protests we've seen at Columbia. I also want to just mention one thing, just by as a side note about the situation at Columbia, and that is to say that I think some of the absolute best reporting that has gone on and continues to go on the Columbia situation is by the Columbia newspaper and the Columbia radio station, 𝐊𝐞𝐭𝐭𝐫𝐶R. And I just want to give a shout out to the students who are running those two outlets. And I think they're really doing a very, very good job. They have had an understanding of the campus. They have been on the campus. They, when Hamilton Hall had the NYPD coming in, there were 𝐊𝐞𝐭𝐭𝐫𝐶R reporters all over campus reporting. It was really great stuff. And so that's not specific to what Dimitri was talking about, but I was just thinking about it, that these I think these students have done really an admirable job of reporting in a time when journalism is also both under financial pressures and political pressures. And so it gives me hope to see that. But I do think that there are broader initiatives against universities, and Jim was talking about that in his opening, and it seems to be part of the playbook that's going on. I don't think it's random, but I don't think it's all based upon protests that were already ongoing. I think Columbia has been an easy target, not just because of the protests that happened before, but the protests also that started happening again at Barnard a few weeks ago.
Right.
On Iran, one of the things that I think has been centrally important to U.S. foreign policy in the region, irrespective of who is the president at the time, since the end of World War II, has been the navigation of waterways. So Dimitri was quite right that the shooting of vessels in the waterways, clogging up the Suez Canal, having ships have to go around Africa, the southern part of Africa, to carry out their routes. This has all been seen as completely unacceptable. It was unacceptable for the Biden administration, unacceptable for the Trump administration. The Iranian involvement is, as Dmitry says, I mean, the supplying of these missiles that are able to actually fire on vessels that is certainly the case. But I mean, it is also the case, as Gary said, that the Houthis also have their own agendas, and there's more going on there. So I still go back to the question, and this was a question I had for the Biden folks as well as I have for the Trump folks. What is really going to constitute victory here? Is it merely the elimination of the threat to navigation? And maybe that is. Well, then let's hear that case and let's see that plan and how it's going to work. Is it something more? Is there something more about the role of the Houthis in Yemen and in that region that is going to be addressed? Let's see that plan and let's see more. Again, I think the collapse of the interagency process and the unwillingness of the current administration to really articulate what the plan is problematic, highly problematic.
Yeah, one thing I just want to add, Dimitri, is that, for example, in the past couple of weeks, I've been discussing with, one of the big issues in Colombia is these IDF veterans who come back to school to finish their education. And I've had long conversations with these guys. Some of them have served in Gaza several times. And what's interesting about all of it is they all want to take Rashid Halidi's class, which cracks me up. They say, "Oh, what's he like?" They're all asking me, "What's he like?" And I do have to note that Deborah Lipstadt, who I dealt with many years ago, who we know is extremely brave in her confrontation with David Irving years ago in
Yeah.
that lawsuit, and who I respect tremendously, she decided not to come and teach. And I hope that is at some point she changes her mind, because Deborah's a great scholar. And I dealt with her many years ago when I was doing radio in the 90s, and benefited tremendously from her insights because her book on Holocaust and all I thought was superb. But, again, it's, having actually seen these issues argued about for 50 years, I just have to say, the place is not some den of everybody walking around with the protocols about the elders of Zion. That's just ridiculous. That really isn't. But anyway, let me bring on. You can come back. We can talk again on this.
But
That.
Jim, can I just mention one thing?
Yeah, go on,
I
Jim.
just want to jump off of something that you just said too,
Right.
and that is, whether it's at the School of General Studies at Columbia, where you have military veterans from the U.S. military, the Israeli military, a wide variety of militaries, or in the other parts of the university or any university, you also have a diversity of opinions and experiences.
Absolutely.
And I think one thing that has been unfortunate to see is to see that see everybody who has served in the IDF and then has come to Columbia categorized in the same way with the same points of views. And in my experience, that is definitely not the case, and that is also not the case about Americans who have served in the military in the Middle East and come back with one point of view. There really is a diversity of points of views, just as there is in Israel a diversity of viewpoints about these many issues that we've been talking about today. And that diversity of viewpoints in Israel tends to get lost when you translate it back into the heat of American politics.
Michael.
Okay.
Michael, go on, Mike.
Yes. Well, this is, I mean, you've dealt with large issues, both specifically and generally. But let me just say a couple of points, and then I have a question. First of all, I just want you to know that I am, one of what I hope are at least tens of millions of Americans who fully support Canada in their conflict with the United States. It's the kind of craziness of what's going on here. It seems like the world is moving to extremes. It's all extremes, and as any biologist will tell you, if you put all the nutrients to the extremities and the center dies, then the organism dies with it. I'm talking about civilization, of course. But the fact is, the problem seems to me, yes, we have in Trump and in a lot of places a bunch of basically people acting like preschoolers, where they see a piece of candy, why can't I eat it? And they just grab it. But the problem to me seems to be, and this is the question, the problem seems to be not the people. I mean, they are obviously a massive problem, people at the top, but the people who put them in. And if you look at the United States, Trump, the real danger isn't when Trump got elected the first time, it's that he got elected the second time, with actually even at least a slight increase in votes. And when I've talked to people who are Trump supporters, as I know Jim has and many of us have, it's not that they're not intelligent. They could be very intelligent, but they refuse to see the reality. In other words, they refuse to see facts. They have actually blamed things that Trump has himself said he's done and is proud of, that did not work out. They blamed it on Biden. They'll blame it on the victim, so to speak. And this is kind of a tunnel vision. Maybe it's caused by our new computerized society, whatever it's caused by. What do we do about this Orwellian situation in which people don't have a common concept of truth, much less reality? And the people that put these people in a democracy, in power, how are we going to kind of change that trend towards this dissolution of this ignoring of reality and any type of mores, this kind of dissolution of civilization? How are we going to attack that end? It's one thing to say, how are we going to take on the Trump administration? How are we going to take on the Houthis or Hamas or Netanyahu or Putin or whatever? But how do we deal with the people that fully support them? Even if it isn't a majority, it's substantial enough of a minority, as we saw in Nazi Germany, to enable them to continue in power and continue doing these crazy, almost societally suicidal things.
Yeah, Jim, how do we deal with that?
Sorry, it's a big question. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, it just, it's an excellent question, and I wholly agree that Trump and the circle around him is one level of issue, and I do agree with Senator Murphy that it's an immediate threat to the viability of American democracy, and many people are not taking it seriously. Many other people, though, to your point, Mike, are cheering it on and see this as exactly what they wanted, and pushing forward on the dissolution of these parts of the government and creating this kind of chaos and et cetera, that this is all for the good. And so I think that there's a lot of people I've worked with, say Americans and others overseas, and who have worked on quote unquote conflict zones, who never imagined that some of the same issues would then become immediately relevant in the United States. And so, Mike, what you're talking about, you're kind of looking forward to, like, well, what would happen post Trump and post trying to piece Humpty Dumpty back together again. And this is one of the great challenges in dealing with any country that's gone through serious conflict and polarization, is finding answers to that. Just as an example, I worked on many USAID projects around the world, and we would often, be trying to piece together or create from whole cloth some version of a sense of loyal opposition, that one could oppose policies of a specific government but still be loyal to the state in situations where that had not been the case. And I think we've gotten to a case here in the U.S. where it's pretty close to the sense of loyal opposition going away, and that if you disagree with somebody, you don't just disagree with their ideas on a particular policy issue, but you see them as wrong, you see them as a bad person, and in fact, you see them as a traitor to the nation. And how you move from that back to normal, quote unquote, normal politics is really the billion dollar question, I think.
Yeah, it's even more than that. I mean, in other words, the idea of how we, if it is a mental health issue on an incredibly mass scale, or if it's just this, whatever it is, the idea of society, of the human race moving and embracing extremes as opposed to, let's say, moderation. I don't know how to deal with it, and I guess no one does at this point. But
One thing. Well, just before Jim jumps in, one thing that's interesting about the question, Michael, is that of course, when you deal with mainstream pluralism as taught in the universities, the question of the middle is extremely important, and that is essentially what you see, an erosion of the middle. But the question of how to communicate with other Americans, one real division is how some people think January 6th was the greatest thing in sliced bread. An actual attempt to launch a coup d'état. And, the rest of us, of course, viewed it with great horror. And so that to me is a real difficult issue. How do you branch that? Because some of them feel that Trump acted constitutionally, which of course is absurd. But, it's a real division. But go on, Jim.
I was just going to say I have friends who have worked on UN programs around the world on disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration programs, DDR programs, and
Wow.
this could well be at some point, and this would mean that we actually would have some kind of positive resolution to the crisis in the United States now. But to have a DDR program in the United States is something I never pondered that we would need, but I think it's exactly what Mike is talking about. I also want to circle back to what Mike was mentioning at the very beginning on Canada. So I'm in Albany right now, in Albany, New York, the state capital, but I grew up north of here, and Montreal was the closest big city to where I grew up. And there were many Quebecois who had moved down to upstate in New York in those days, and we all went to school together. And to imagine that we have gotten to this point with Canada, again, as I said before, in addition to it being childish and engaged in bullying activities, I really am pondering what more is behind all of that from the American side. On the Canadian side, it has really had a very interesting effect on what are going to be upcoming elections in Canada. Now, the new prime minister against the likely conservative candidate, Pierre Poilievre. And, I think 3 or 4 months ago, Polyev was a slam dunk to win, and that is not the case anymore, because by many Canadians now he's seen as Trump North.
Wow.
yeah, I know. Yes.
All right.
Um,
Thank you. Michael, let me bring Alex
sure.
in. Go on, Alex.
Yeah, thanks. It's a common misconception, the idea that Ukraine was somehow going to be, there was a scenario where Ukraine would be allowed to keep their Soviet nuclear weapons, after the fall of the Soviet Union, or any, again, Kazakhstan, I think, and Belarus also had some nukes. Because actually the Ukrainians, it's documented that they tried to basically break the permissive active links that, would allow you to fire, shoot one of those weapons. But they were never able to do that, fortunately. And the fear there again, and this clue again from the U.S. government, was not that again, Ukraine was going to keep their nukes, but that they were going to basically break open the nukes, and because of the dire economic situation that again the former Soviet countries had at the time, that they would basically take the nuclear material out, the plutonium or uranium and tritium and so on, and essentially sell it all on the black market, even to say terrorists. Yeah, I want to mention again, there's been an interesting kind of development with Colombia, with them also firing and expelling the head of the student union there. Going on the guy's name.
Yeah, we mentioned that earlier.
Okay.
So
you guys did, but I also put some posts on that in the chat. But what I wanted to ask about is, I don't know if you've, and again, this might be something that actually, since you said that at Hopkins, which I assume, I'm guessing is where you are, they also denied funding the Trump administration. So I want to ask, and this may have happened up at Hopkins too, to your president. But again, this interesting letter that the Times reported that was sent to the president and chairman of the co-chairs of the board of trustees up there, saying again what essentially how you have to kowtow to the Trump administration to get the funding back. So I thought it was interesting to look at what they're asking for in terms of, and have your comments about that, Jim. So again, the points are that they want them to implement is, again, meaningful discipline, which again, they're telling them what to do. That means expulsion or multi-year suspensions for, pro-Palestine protesters. I guess were involved in the whatever occurred, at Columbia.
Colombia just did that, Alex. They just did that a few days ago. Go on.
But again, I want to get Jim's comments.
Yeah, sure, of course.
His opinion. So again, they're telling them how to change their disciplinary system to where essentially the president of the university can do everything by fiat. So obviously the end of any kind of due process and a kind of, authoritarian version of discipline by, again, a single individual. And empower the office of the president to suspend or expel students with an appeal process through the office of the president here. Prevent disruption of teaching, research, campus life. Again, a mask ban. So obviously, they can be, any student protesters can be arrested. And again, the constitutionality of that, of course, is something, that could be questioned. Here, hold all student groups accountable. So again, I guess, again, more discipline on that. Of course, adaptation of the specific IHRA definition of what anti-Semitism is, which is, rather problematic. And again, they mentioned anti-Zionist is to be basically protest is to be made, discrimination against Jews must be addressed. Empower local enforcement. So again, bring the cops on campus, I guess is what that is. And here, again, essentially repress their Middle East, South Asian, and African studies program. So again, comprehensive admissions reform, which I'm guessing they mean basically, screen future Columbia students so that, they don't have dangerous ideas, essentially. So again, here, so Jim, again, I would wonder about your response to this letter and what you think it says about, again, what the Trump administration is trying to do here, and what do you think the response of universities, including yours, is going to be? Thank you.
Thank you. So I just want to mention one thing about Ukraine first. So I didn't want to give the impression that I was thinking that Ukraine was really going to use the weapons. This was really more. I've seen it bubbling up now as a thought experiment about to say, using Ukraine as an example and using the failure to support the details of the Budapest memorandum as an example to basically say, should countries in general, should they consider acquiring nuclear weapons as an assurance, as some sort of assurance against being invaded? And this is not the first time this has come up, but it's come up more specifically on Ukraine, and as it relates to the Budapest Memorandum. But you're quite right. The concern then, and I remember it very well because I was in government, was about so-called loose nukes. That the nuclear material would be either put on the market for sale, or it could be stolen and it wasn't being properly locked down, etc. But anyway, but your points are well taken about what Ukraine was likely to do with the weapons themselves. But it has circled back as an issue and been applied to what Gary was talking about. And the Iranians, whether Iran, Dmitry said, they're under no threat of being invaded. Perhaps that's true, but certainly under threat of being attacked from their perspective. I'm not an apologist for the Iranians, but I'm just talking in general about, are we on the verge of entering a new period of nuclear proliferation? And some are saying that this is an outgrowth of the chaotic situation that we're in. On Colombia, one part of that letter that you were showing, Alexander, that I think is getting a lot of attention in places like the Middle East Studies Association, is this idea that departments would go into receivership, and what kind of receivership, who decides what, where is it all going, there's great concern, but is it really, what is that concern going to result in? And then on the nature of debate in general. So under the guidelines that are alluded to in that letter and definitions of anti-Semitism and whatever, would in fact people be able to seriously criticize the specific policies of specific government, in this case the Netanyahu government, to say like, well, policy X, policy Y, or the policies that are putting forward by Smotrich or Ben-Gvir or etc. These are problematic. Many Israelis have these debates. This is these are the debates about politics, about governance, not about the existence of Israel as a state. So where is that line, particularly on the basis of that particular definition that is being cited in that letter? I think it remains to be decided. In general, the role of universities in pushing back politically, universities across the United States, I don't think they're going to find much of an audience in the executive branch at the White House or in the Department of Education, etc. But I think they will find an audience with their members of Congress and the senators who represent their states. And I have not seen any kind of serious pushback to those senators, and those senators then saying, oh, this is a big problem, that University X, which is hugely important to my state, now is losing international students, losing research money, losing faculty, having staff firings, that admissions have been affected, and fewer students are applying to come to this university. All of those translate into really negative consequences, not just for the university, but for the communities the university is in and the state that community is in. I haven't seen that translate into political action yet, and in fact, I've seen really quite the opposite. I've seen a lot of passive reaction and silence.
Well, one thing I want to add, that one of your colleagues at Bard, Ken Stern,
yes,
the
yes.
Bard Center for State for Hate. Now, Ken was actually involved in the crafting of the IHRA statement years ago, and he's rejected it. He said that the issue of putting anti-Zionism as a anti-Semitic trope is, of course, absurd. And I should add that what happened at Columbia last week, as a result of all this, they were going to have a big conference with scholars from around the world on anti-Zionism and Zionism and its critics. It was canceled. And so this kind of stuff is starting to happen. But Brandon, go on, Brandon. Please unmute.
This really is a question. Why? All right, let's look at the Panama Canal as opposed to the Suez Canal. if Venezuela, this isn't physically possible, but if Venezuela started shooting missiles at ships sailing through the Panama Canal, how would Panama and the United States react? And the reason I'm asking this question is to get to Egypt's reaction to what's going on in the Suez Canal. Can you explain to me, like, in basic terms, why they're losing a tremendous amount of commercial revenue from ships not navigating the Suez? That's my basic assumption. And, I've seen data that corroborates that. What is preventing them from simply sending an expeditionary force into Yemen and saying, you know what, we're backing the other side in your civil war, and you get the hell out of the capital? What, and if it's religious considerations or cultural considerations, then how can anyone believe that anything can be done in Gaza with the Egyptians?
Well, on the Suez Canal, I don't have the figures in front of me, but I know I've seen probably the same reports that you've seen, that the Egyptians are losing tremendous amounts of money as commercial traffic has, been really reduced enormously. So, as I said before, this has always been, since the end of World War II, a centerpiece of one of the centerpieces of American policy in the region is the navigation of the choke points, not just the Suez Canal, but other maritime choke points. And so this has been, so it's not surprising that the U.S. would want to take action and along the same lines as what the scenario you laid out with the Panama Canal. If there were some other actor that were shooting missiles and making it impossible to go through that canal, what would the U.S. do? It would undoubtedly take some kind of military action to try to stop that from happening. That's one thing. But I think that the idea of doing some kind of land invasion in Yemen is that has a history in the region of having been the kind of of Vietnam of the region for Egypt, and they got into a quagmire themselves, and getting on whether it's American troops or doing it through coalition or something on the ground in Yemen to do something. I'm sure that there is, even with the current administration in Washington, great reluctance to do that. And go ahead, Brandon.
No, I'm specifically asking you seem to really have your finger on the pulse of Egypt and the whole Middle East. So that's what I'm asking about. Yeah, not Americans, no.
Yeah, I mean, so Egypt returning, that I think there would be even greater reluctance for Egypt to return to Yemen. There are still people who know that history quite well, know that quagmire quite well, and unlikely to do it. The other thing is and I think this has been a great failing of American military engagements over the past several decades, particularly in the Middle East, is to try to match up aspirations and actual capacity. And so, if we're talking about the Egyptian military engaging militarily in Yemen, just off the cuff, but I don't have a lot of confidence that they would have the capacity to have that be anything other than yet another quagmire. And I think they have the same sense of that. And so I haven't heard anything at all about the Egyptians really getting involved in that, even though they have a big stake in it. Rather, what has happened is that the U.S. government has tried to backfill those financial losses for Egypt with more financial support of Egypt. So there is an understanding that Egypt is losing a lot of money. Egypt is the second largest recipient of U.S. assistance behind Israel, and the second largest in the world, not just second largest in the region. And so we're already giving them a lot of money, mostly in military materiel, but this is additional money to backfill on the loss of the Suez crisis. So I think that's really what Egypt has been literally lobbying for, is that money to come to them to backfill rather than Egypt militarily getting involved. The one thing that does make me think about, though, is that before October 7th, we saw for a few years more and more voices on Capitol Hill that were questioning the amount of money that goes to Egypt on an annual basis and the support of Egypt carte blanche in the face of their own really negative performance in terms of human rights. And so Senator Murphy, Hakeem Jeffries, others were questioning this really out loud, that stopped after October 7th, and Egypt was seen as indispensable post October 7th. Also, in the midst of all that, you had the arrest and the trial of Bob Menendez, who was the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, who was being paid off by who? Egyptian intelligence, in money, in gold bars, in various things. And so the money has kept flowing. Egypt is seen as too big to fail, too important to fail. You have, unless I've missed it, heard really no questions in the last couple of year and a half on Egypt's performance on human rights. So that's a long way of saying I think Egypt, they know they're losing money in the canal. They're feeling that pinch. The economy is in really rough shape in Egypt, but they're trying to mitigate that with additional funding from Washington rather than military engagement.
Thank you very much.
And one thing that Alex just put in the chat, which is, of course, something that Jim just raised, was the whole war that they waged in Yemen in the 60s. But there's another two issues. One, lessons being drawn by the Saudi intervention into the Yemeni civil war, which was unsuccessful.
Yes, also unsuccessful, yes.
And thirdly, people forget that at the time of Camp David, when the Egyptian army was reorganizing, there was a plan to essentially use the Egyptian army as essentially a supplement to the rapid deployment force in Africa. And there was actually an attempt to create part of the Egyptian army for that purpose, and that flopped. They were going to send it into Zaire initially. So there's all these reasons why Egypt, along most important, of course, is the political reasons that they don't want to get involved in this. Now let me bring in Ralph. Ralph, you're unmuted.
Yeah.
Go on, Ralph.
Yeah, thank you. I want to get back to the university question. But first of all, you mentioned Ken Stern. He's a colleague of mine in the Third Narrative Project, and it isn't that he rejects IRA, the IRA definition of anti-Semitism. It's just that he, like myself, rejects the idea of using it as legislation to ban people from contracts and whatever else with the government because they define themselves as anti-Zionist or whatever. That's not proper and clearly a violation of the First Amendment. I do happen to think that IRA is a good definition because, in fact, Israel is a very important component of Jewish identity for most Jews around the world. It's not true of everybody. There are certainly Jews who define themselves as anti-Israel, anti-Zionist, but most Jews have a visceral connection that they feel with Israel's existence. Going back to the universities, part of the problem with this ongoing situation, this crisis, which now with the Trump administration has become a threat to maybe even the existence, certainly the research functioning of major universities in terms of withdrawing funds, is that the demonstrations really got out of hand. Basically, I don't see any basis for the fact that you had these protest encampments. I mean, I understand a protest. I understand making demonstrations. I understand making, a whole series of demonstrations on an issue. And God knows, I understand people protesting, Israel's counterattacks into Gaza, which have been so devastating. But taking up property, endlessly on campuses. I don't see why. You certainly, seizing buildings. I mean, these are things that, we're very disruptive. And you did have harassment of Jewish students that was going on. It's true that they weren't anti-Semitic in an out and out way. I mean, they accepted the participation of Jews who define themselves as anti-Israel or anti-Zionist. The big demonstration at Trump Tower the other day was hundreds of people affiliated with the Jewish Voice for Peace, which is anti-Zionist, which is against Israel's existence. They were fine with that. But you have, for example, the crisis re-erupting with what's been happening at Barnard. So you had, I don't know, 2, 3, 4 masked people enter a class on Israeli history and disrupt the class session, and refuse the professor's invitation to sit down and have a discussion. Instead, they go on with this disruption. They lecture the class. They harangue the class. They leave flyers. I mean, they wanted to hand out some flyers, and people didn't take them, so they threw them on the floor. This sort of thing. There's something very wrong about that kind of situation. And then you had Mahmoud Khalil was involved in the group that took over Barnard's library in support of students who were expelled as a result. And taking over a building again is very wrong. You had an administrator who was trapped there, who had to ask their permission to go to the restroom and was taunted as she went to the restroom. I mean, there's something very wrong here. Now, that doesn't mean that, Khalil should be deported if he hasn't been convicted of a crime. And that's part of what stinks about this situation with Khalil. But I certainly have very mixed feelings about this situation with Khalil and the demonstrations. By and large, I think it's a complicated issue.
Ralph, go on, Jim.
No, I was just about to bounce it to you because I know you are much closer to this situation than I am. I mean, I can jump in later, but very interested to hear what you have to say, Jim.
Well, I hear you, Ralph. The issue of, let's look objectively at the order that was given by Rubio to deport Khalil. He's viewed as a threat to the United States. And I guess from their perspective, keep in mind that, who the hell ever expected this encampment movement would have a national and international impact, which is essentially what happened last year.
They allowed it to get out of hand.
Well, see, here's the issue. Like, again, you're talking to somebody who actually prevented a building from being taken over once in 1976. So I have a little bit of firsthand experience. I had to stop people from taking Lowell Library one night. So that's a credential that a lot of these guys don't have. So, the other aspect of this is that, I understand I've talked to many people who feel the same way you do at Columbia and off the campus. And I understand that. there's tremendous. This issue is never. Um, I personally feel this issue has been improperly handled by the university for 50 years. Because this issue, I watched it happen in the 70s, I watched it happen in the 80s, I watched it happen in the 90s. In the early 2000s, I was approached by people who wanted to have me go into Joe Massad's class and film it, and I said, I'm not going to do that. And I already knew Joe when he was a graduate student. I already knew that, Joe has a rather hot tempered opinion about stuff. So, this issue has always been a hot button issue, and it exploded on October 7th in ways that one could hardly predict. Now, that day after, on October 8th, I put Rashid on the air in New York, and Rashid completely condemned the killings on October 7th. Completely. He then said we have to understand why it happened, which I think we all agree on. And so, the whole thing is just, grown out of that. The issue of Milbank Hall and all that. I mean, again, I guess it's because of the nature of the fact that the media is concentrated in New York and people love, let's go see what happened at Columbia. I guess it's a vestige of 1968 with the impact of that being so national. Because remember, Tom Hayden wrote his famous article in Ramparts, One Too Many Columbias. And the right wing responded to that also. One, two, three, many Columbias to essentially counter that. So again, I didn't understand that until recently when a scholar did a book about this. So, I hear what you're saying. I don't necessarily completely agree with you, but I also don't agree with shrillness and, the inability to try to understand what other people think about such a highly emotional and politically charged issue. That I've always felt a problem with. But go on, Jim.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, you're much closer to this than I am, particularly on the Columbia campus. I would say just in general about students as well. So I do think that it is unfortunate when real criticism of policies gets mixed up with, I think, misguided symbolism and misguided taking sides. And as I said before, reducing complex situations into chance and into black versus white. If that were the case, the situation, many situations in the world and in the Middle East would have been solved a long time ago. They're far more complex than that. But one of the things that I think has become clear over this time with these protests and on other issues as well. If we go back to, let's say Occupy Wall Street or other things, the things that Jim was talking about, way back in the ice ages of my days on campus, the protests on South Africa and apartheid, is that students end up using the venue where they are and the institutions that they're part of as a target, but really the target is something else. And in this case, the target was the Biden administration and policy, but finding, no way to voice their concerns and their upsettedness to anybody who could really make a difference. So the ire gets targeted at the institution that is their home. And I see that as a greater dysfunction in our body politic, that people on any number of issues, and this is on the right and on the left and in between, are not finding someone to talk to who is really going to hear them and make a difference. And I think this is a great frustration of many decades building. And we, to use Jim's word, we've seen it explode in this case on the Columbia campus, but I think it's been bubbling up for a very long time.
Yeah.
I just wanna say, and I appreciate what Jim has just said, in particular about this question of protests not honing in on policy. As a liberal Zionist, I could feel some sympathy for the protest against certainly Netanyahu government policies and the particular tactics they've used in fighting Hamas. But as somebody who would be defined as a liberal Zionist, I am seen as an enemy by most of these protesters. They would not accept me as somebody who could be reasonably dealt with.
Yeah, and that is very problematic from my perspective, and I think this whole take sidism is so problematic on this issue, and you know. Conflicts, when they are pulled back into, as I said before, the heat of American politics, take on a different tenor and take on a massive polarization where where all the details, all the nuances, all the complexities are somehow sucked out of the environment, and it's one side or the other in a way that I think is just it doesn't get anybody toward really trying to address the actual immediate issue that is at stake, and certainly not the broader issue that is running under. And you know, I saw that on the South Africa issue years ago. I saw it, you know, more. You know, from my family, I'm part Irish, on the Irish Troubles too. The ways in which Irish Americans would address the Irish Troubles was really very, very different than people in Ireland at the time and now as well.
Absolutely. And I had a very good friend whose grandfather was in the Easter Rising in 1916, and he would, of course, have a very strong reaction to people who got involved in the Provos and all these other movements. I want to say that one thing I've noticed also is how the Holocaust and World War II is dealt with by some of the folks when we argue, because some of them just completely dismiss that, which of course is absurd. Michael, we're going to now sort of wrap up. Michael, go on.
Yeah, well, first of all, I want to thank you for bringing in Ireland, considering what tomorrow is.
Yes, it was on my mind.
Yeah, it's on mine also because I was born on that day. And I do remember when I was in the Irish club in my university, Stony Brook University on Long Island, that when we had people come in from supported by NORAID, some Irish activists, we would all have drinks, and then when the Irish American members of the club would all fall out, and we were having beers, and they said, "Okay, Mike, now there's just us. We can talk for real." And I said, "Why?" He said, "Because Irish Americans don't really understand. They think that just because they're of Irish descent, a lot of them, they think that they have a grip on what's going on in Ireland." But yeah, the Irish issue is always a good example, and I think that actually, let me get to the question that I want to ask. The thing about the campus is, I know a lot of several Jewish students on campus have told me that they feel threatened when they're on campus, not at Columbia, but at different universities throughout the world. The idea is that there is a difference. I mean, certainly if people feel threatened, or if it's actually directly interfering in their studies and their participation in university events, that's one thing. But again, it gets to the line, and can't a line be drawn? This is one question, between just discomfort and feeling uncomfortable and feeling threatened, between what is a threat and what is just something that's not making you feel good. Because if it just doesn't make you feel good, my attitude would be too bad. But if you actually are feeling threatened, then that's something that needs to be dealt with. Also, and to be anti-Zionist without being against the right of any race, religion, culture, ethnicity, or national origin, in other words, which actually covers every state, to be anti-Zionist could be construed as being anti-Semitic, because you're saying, well, Jews can't have this, but everybody else can. However, if a student is not denying the actual basic, and there are different interpretations of Zionism, I admit, but without the basic idea of Zionism, if they're saying, no, we are not against the idea of Israel existing. I mean, isn't that a line that can be drawn where you could say, okay, if you're not against that and you're just against the policies, there's no problem. And I think the problem here we have is that, as you stated, that people are conflating anti-Zionism with with being against the policies of the present Zionist government. We also have to remember that what was going on, you mentioned that the people in Gaza were getting fed up with Hamas. Well, people in Israel prior to October 7th were getting fed up with Netanyahu, as we saw in the protests in the streets in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. But the idea is that, I mean, aren't there lines? I mean, aren't these lines kind of clear? I mean, you know, in other words, aren't there like direct questions you can ask and say, yeah, okay, if you're not advocating for the elimination of the state of Israel, then you're okay. Also, I know, to turn it to U.S. policy in the Middle East, I know that's a little off topic, but the idea is that what we're going, again, it's this extremes on October 7th. The thing that alarmed me, that disturbed me and made me a little cynical, was that on October 8th, before Israel had made any military move against Gaza, any invasion or any bombing or shelling or whatever of Gaza, there were massive protests against Israel in the wake, almost, it seemed to me, celebratory of what happened on October 7th. And again, this idea goes to the extreme. So is U.S. policy under the present insane administration, is U.S. policy, is there a method to their madness where they're trying to play bad cop to enable Netanyahu to play good cop, or to go to an extreme in order to make a settlement more to their benefit? Or is it just absolute extremism?
Thank you, Michael.
And yeah, I mean, there's, so, you know, Michael, I think that drawing a line, or a clear line on what can be said or not said, you know, I think being able to criticize the current government of Israel is still has to be, by any definition, on the line of what is acceptable. To just say this is a government of a nation state, and we are going to kind of critically analyze their policies, not just how it relates to Palestinians, but also one ought to be taking a hard look at those policies as to whether or not this is in the best interest of Israel itself. And Israelis have this debate all the time. Where are these policies going? Does it help Israel, as well as, you know, how does it relate to the Palestinians? How does it relate to the broader Middle East? And so it seems to me that ought to be on the table as something that's acceptable, that we can have that debate about any country and any of their policies, and certain countries ought not to be immune. That's a debate about governance, and it's a debate about the use of force, and, you know, as I said, you know, creating a political horizon to end conflicts, and about the safety and security of Israel itself. In terms of U.S. policy, you know, as I said before, I really struggle with when I see the actions and the statements of this current administration in Washington. I worry that by trying to go back and make sense of it in some way, that it really is what the New York Times is often accused of, as insane washing, or giving theory to something and strategy to something that really is just kind of visceral and is intuitive and is random. I just don't know. I honestly don't know where the reality is there. Is there some deeper plan afoot, or is this a kind of intuitive and, is there some just kind of whatever the president thinks at the moment? I truly don't know.
Go on, Frank.
Yeah, hi. I'd like to use Jim's example of citing my life experience. I was at one point young, okay? Now, because of that, I understand that young people have to be malleable. They have to be able to be manipulated for two fundamental reasons, and these are Darwinian. They have to be manipulated so that they reproduce, and they have to be able to cross no man's land when it comes to defending their society. And that's the same thing applies to a school of fish, a herd of buffalo, or even a beehive. That's what's fundamental. Now, you can rationalize those things away, and you can do it on campuses. There was an anti-war movement that was very successful in Vietnam, during the Vietnam period. Absolutely. And you've got the LGBTQ. Yes, that will put a stymie on any efforts to reproduce, especially when you attack, say, the Catholic Church and say that they're full of pedophiles. Because the church, fundamental reason for existence is to make sure that the society that it's representing reproduces. That's why the Islamic faith is so important. Now, if you understand that, you understand that state actors understand that too, and that state actors are using campuses. I mean, this should be obvious because of the anomalies that we see here in the United States. For instance, it makes no sense that not a soul stands up for Ukraine on campuses. Nobody says anything about Russia. Nobody says squat. They only get up for one reason, that's Gaza. They go and they do all that they do. Well, you could argue, well, they didn't, because the arguments of Putin are correct, as I'm sure Alex would say. Well, that doesn't make sense either. There is no debate. There is radicalization, which is what state actors do. They act on other states that they want to undermine. If they can undermine them in those two areas, reproduction and self-defense, that's a very, very successful thing. Now, the thing about the Protocols of Zion, which came out of Russia, was that it was a very effective tool, an extremely effective tool, and is still an effective tool. But what is disturbing is that there are paradigm shifts in power in the world. And what is particularly disturbing is, and I've had a surprise birthday, which I knew about. And when I walked in, I pretended that I was surprised when I got the half a glass of wine. I said, what a pleasant surprise. Same thing happened on October 7th. Mossad acted surprised because they didn't want to upset the surprise. Otherwise, there wouldn't be a casus belli, which they got from it. Now, it went very badly wrong. There's no question. But to pretend that Mossad had no idea about what Hamas was about to do defies belief because of all the liquidations that took place after that and what they did. But where they were fooled is what the Turkish intelligence has just done in Syria by backing the Sunni. Now there's going to be a conflict as to whether they can put the Russians back there. There is a connection between Israel and Russia, which is disturbing, extremely disturbing. They do not support Ukraine at all. There's something rotten in this administration, and there is something rotten in Israel's administration. And it is up to the opposition to do something about it in both countries. But we don't see anything because our Democrats over here are so effing useless. It just defies belief. But I guess my question is, why is it that we pussyfoot around the fact that we are under attack by state actors? That's my question.
Well, thank you, Frank. Go on, Jim.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot there, Frank. I would just say that, you were concluding with the passivity of the American Democrats, and also you were talking about how certain conflicts are selected to carry out what you're describing, and others seem to be completely ignored. I mean, I think there was some profile on Ukraine for at least a while, but others are completely ignored for reasons that I think are, have to do with governments and media, and also uglier things. So, like, why has no one really paid attention to what's going on in Sudan, as an example? And that it's not seen as, a part of the world that people are caring about. It is not seen as a part of the world that U.S. foreign policy is caring about. It's ignored left, right, and center, and no one even blinks an eye at it. I mean, I do a regular appearance on the NPR station in this area, and I asked them at one point to make sure that we talked about Sudan, and it was after had been some specific level of violence that I think just demanded that we talk about it, and we did, but really no interest at all from the audience. No one wrote in as they would on some of these other topics that you've mentioned, Frank, and so I find it noteworthy and concerning, and in fact depressing.
Right. And I should note, Alex has the last comment, but we are going to be having a discussion with Jonathan Haslam, who wrote Hubris, The American Origins of Russia's War Against Ukraine. And those of you who are not familiar with Jonathan Haslam, he was a student of E.H. Carr's. He wrote a whole series of books on Soviet foreign policy. And he basically decided, I guess he's now retired and as a fellow at Cambridge. He's now has just done an interesting book about the very issues we've been talking about, the origins of American relations with Ukraine in this situation that we're talking about now. Alex, go on, Alex.
Yeah, I'll just say I've read the entire book. Recommend it to everybody. For those of us in New York City, I think the public library has quite a few copies if you want to borrow from them. But I actually, mostly had a comment, which is, in response to what Ralph and others said. We need to remember, what these protesters and students, what they think they're fighting, which again, they think they're fighting and responding to a genocide. And, I think, if one were to agree with that, again, we can disagree about their tactics, in terms of what we think is, will work, or what we think is moral. But I think if we were to think of other genocides that we can all agree occurred and were genocides, like say Rwanda, or say the Cambodian case, for example, that back then we would I think in retrospect we would love to have the kind of response to those genocides that are being seen, now to what's going on in Israel. Again, if we agree that it's a genocide. So I think we need to, keep that in mind. And again, as Jim kind of alluded to, of course, there's also, our different appreciation of 1960 and what happened at Colombia, now, which is end of the Vietnam anti-war movement, for example, and of course, much more positive light, including Colombia. They reference it in their web page. What a wonderful, and to which again Rashid Khalidi, who Jim talked about. I mean, he himself said in a speech to the students that you guys will be remembered in the way that 1968 students were remembered in the future. So I think that kind of longer historical perspective on these kinds of things is something we can think about, and how the Columbia students and the response to what happened in Gaza is going to be seen 10 years or 20, 30 years from now, which again given the previous response to the Vietnam and so on, I think it's going to be and maybe even by some of us here who decry it now will there's a very good book out that I just read by Omar El Akkad with the title of, One Day Everyone Will Always Have Been Against This, that talks specifically about that issue of, that how people change, their views of these kind of historical events in the long term. Yeah, thanks. Thanks for a great talk, Jim.
Well, and also, before Jim concludes his comments, one thing that does strike me with this, from the point of view as an American, of course, is that when people bring up the whole question of settler colonialism to an American audience, to Americans thinking about our own history, people, hey, what about the settlement in New England in the 17th century? Or what about Virginia at the same time? I mean, and then the whole issue of our history starting from landing at Plymouth Rock, going straight across the continent. Settler colonialism is something that, quote, is not a, quote, lefty type of topic. It's sort of a realistic issue to think about historically. And another problem I always have sometimes with these debates is that, we know what happened in the United States after 9/11. I was downtown that day when that happened. Very vivid recollection. It took me weeks to get that dust out of my lungs. But I also think about what would happen if the United States was attacked the way Israel was on October 7th and 40,000 Americans were killed, which is what the equivalent is. So again, I hear what you're saying, Alex, and that's the dilemmas we're in. Because hopefully, out of this terrible, horrible situation we're watching, something positive can emerge. I'm always hopeful about that, even though my cynicism barometer is pretty high. But let Jim make his concluding remarks. And again, thank you so much, Jim, for spending time with us today.
Well, thanks for having me. I've enjoyed the conversation very much with everyone here. I know Gary had to leave, but it was really a great treat that he was able to also weigh in on the Iranian issue. And I mean, I think the conversations that we've had on so many of these topics has really been valuable, and valuable to me too, at a time when I feel like it's all the more important that we find venues in which we can have serious conversations, maybe even serious debates and serious disagreements, but do them in a way that's respectful, as these have been, and helpful to all involved. And I really appreciate it. And so thanks, Jim, for inviting me, and thank you for bringing this together. And everybody, thank you for taking time out of your day. You could be doing 1,000 different things, but you've decided to spend this time having these conversations. And so I really do truly appreciate it. This is not just sort of a throwaway thank you. I find it, it's, as I said, it's more important now than ever.
Agreed. And we will continue to do this because I think we all will agree that the United States is at a historical turning point, and it's up to us to make sure it's to a positive end, not a negative end. Well, thank you so much, Jim.
Thanks.